So, good morning, everyone. To be completely transparent, just as we were taking our short break, I made a nice hot cup of tea and promptly dumped it right and straight into the top of my computer. Uh, so I'm speaking to you now from my iPad because my computer is making a very sad, whiny kind of noise that I suspect means my several months' desire to get a new one won't be taking place sometime soon. But there we are. But what I wanted to talk about today was suffering, as my computer is now suffering and my nerves are suffering because of that little human thing that happened. So I think in my experience of Buddhist practice, we talk a lot about suffering, physical pain, emotional pain, what I refer to as psychospiritual pain. And I think that, for myself and for us as humans, we require connections, love, intimacy, some sense of safety, and importantly, some sense of purpose. In his book, Instructions to the Cook, Bernie Glassman, reflecting on Dogen's fascicle, says that he refers to this as having a life that matters. And so Bernie, of course, instructs us to create one. If we don't have a life that matters, it's really simple, Bernie says, do something about it. And so I've been thinking about that in terms of what causes suffering for us generally, and what causes suffering for me and other people that I know is really sort of boils down to that. Do we have that sense of safety, a sense of intimacy and love, sense of connection, and a sense of safety? And so, of course, in the best of times, those are challenges on a day-to-day basis for any of us that encounters other human beings as we go through our day. But as we've been living in quarantine, I think many of us have had certain really new levels of dis-ease, uncomfortableness, that steady uncomfortableness, and that I think we've just had to find new ways to work with that. And I think the lack of having that sense of ease and safety and comfort is originally what brought many of us to the door of a Zen center, and what keeps some of us here on a day-to-day or as needed basis. The things that are happening in our lives generally, and of course right now. So I'm moved to remember the teaching of the Buddha that says, I teach one thing and one thing only, suffering and the cessation of suffering. And so, of course, as those wiser than me know, there's some great debate about whether the Buddha actually ever said that. But given what we know, and we heard a little bit last week that, the Buddha's words were mouth to mouth for 400 years or so, and then another 100 years being written down, and then they were edited by groups. So I'm not sure whether the Buddha actually said, I come to teach one thing and one thing only, suffering and the cessation of suffering. But because we don't have any proof that he didn't say it, I'm going to go today with that he did. So, during these last 15 months of mandated isolation and solitude, most of us have spent plenty of time thinking about exactly how we lived our lives, our relational lives, before March of 2020. Some of us have spent some time thinking about what was happening to our lives, especially our relational lives, during this quarantine. And then recently, what will it be like to make our relational lives fuller, bigger somehow after quarantine? And most of us, that felt a little casual because we've heard a lot of people talk about, well, the end of this year or late fall or something, or 2021. And we assumed we have lots of time to get our act together. But I got a note in my status with Meditation and Recover, I got a note from the Zen Center Thursday of this week saying they're opening the conference center. So if we wanted to book our room, we could book a room. And that was the same day that the CDC said that we may all, those who have been vaccinated properly, run back into the streets maskless at our choosing. And I think the political message there was somehow supposed to be a joy-filled message, but everyone I've talked to since that message came out and it may be the kind of people I associate with, have really responded to that idea of, okay, starting whenever it is, today or next Monday, we can be maskless. And so that's one concern. Just like, oh, no, okay, here we are faced with this opportunity to quarantine, at least as we know it, to be over with. And of course, that creates more suffering, trying to figure out what we'll do with that as individuals, as families, as sanghas, as residents and non-residents of a Zen center. And then there's the other piece of that, as I say, I think that most of life is relational, and that's how we need to look at it. And so we think about, or I've been thinking about the last few days, all of those people that I've thought about seeing for the last 15 months, but couldn't because they or I were in quarantine or were at a distance that made that not possible. And then I thought about all the people that I have enjoyed not engaging with, and being able to use the quarantine as the excuse. Couldn't possibly come there. It's not possible. And some of those are immediate family members and good friends, but the quarantine gave us an opportunity to sit and hopefully reflect on how we want to show up in our own lives and other people's lives, and how we want them to show up. Based on our own needs and desires, and our sense of boundaries, and sometimes based on a deep sense of responsibility to others, and sometimes based on something called codependency. I'll show up places because you think you should. But this concept of suffering and what does suffering mean has really been on my mind as we think about our own lives, my own life, my own spiritual practice, and the world in which we live. So Philip Moffat, the writer, says that in Buddhism, living beings are trapped in a cycle of existence known as samsara. In samsara, we wander aimlessly and experience unbearable suffering day and night, year after year, life after life. And so that sounds like, that's a really cheery concept. And certainly people would want to rush to the door of the Zendo to sign up for that. But he goes on to say that in order to heal this disease-like condition, first we have to find its cause, and then apply a medicine-like path of training to restore our original good health, which is enlightenment. And that's one of the things that attracted me to Buddhism in the first place, was the conversation, the teachings, the hope of returning to your original life. As the Buddha talked about the innate nobility of all beings, that in our authentic selves, we have the capacity to be people of love and to love others and to be loved by others. We have the capacity to have good boundaries that are strong but not off-putting, and in which we can take care of ourselves and be fully present for others. So those words of Philip's came from an article in Lion's Roar last year, where 9 teachers talked about their views of suffering. And as I thought about it, and if you can dig out that old issue, it was April of last 2020. And there's 9 different folks, but one of the things that keeps showing up in those articles, which is something that I try every day to embrace, and sometimes successfully and sometimes not, is that each of the teachers that writes in there at some point in their particular article talks about that suffering isn't a condemnation, but suffering is 2 things. One is dealing with reality, and reality not being what we might want it to be or what it used to be. And so we have that part of suffering, but it's also a joyous opportunity. And so that really intrigued me and led me to thinking, it's like, suffering is a joyous opportunity. And as I thought back on the many years that I've been practicing Buddhism and Zen particularly, I thought, now that I think about it, that is exactly why I came to this practice, and why I've stayed in this practice is that opportunity. So suffering as a joyous opportunity is what I've been thinking about the last few days and few weeks. Let me just say that, like most of us, I do not enjoy suffering or pain. I spent much of my life trying to escape having to deal with any suffering or pain. not always skillfully moving through it or past it or working with it, but oftentimes in my earlier life, trying to drink it away, drug it away for many, many years, trying to keep just as busy as possible, sometimes still a curse, so that I could be distracted from the feelings of pain and suffering. And, like many of us who grew up when I did, and you can place yourself on that spectrum, having lots and lots of relationships, which is a very nice word for what I was actually having in the 70s and 80s, because they didn't last long enough to spell the word relationship. But using other people also to distract myself from the realities of my life, both the suffering and the joy. So as I was reading that article, Thich Nhat Hanh says that the Buddha called suffering the holy truth, the holy truth. And he says this is because suffering has the capacity to show us the path to liberation. Experiencing and knowing this truth, he says, gives our lives wholeness and peace and frees us from the exhausting posture of pretense and denial. And those words really, really resonated with me. The idea that, and I don't know if any of you can relate, but for years when anybody would say, how are you? I would say, fine. And the louder and more gregariously I said that, the less true it was oftentimes. And so, what I recognize is that I had, and many of you, maybe all of us, have a tendency to run away from suffering. And then there's another teaching by Thich Nhat Hanh in that article where he says that the fact is, without suffering, there is no way to cultivate understanding and compassion. And without understanding and compassion, there is no way to find happiness. So sometimes it seems to me that what the gift, this joyous opportunity of suffering is to say, okay, if I take a look at it, I'm feeling really uncomfortable. I have dis-ease today and what's going on. I know I'm suffering, I know I'm feeling grief, or I'm feeling sorrow, or I'm feeling anger or frustration. And so, okay, I could medicate that, or get busy and not notice it, or do any of the other number of things that I mentioned. Or I could sit in practice and say, let me think about what is causing that. What is causing that might be something that I generated. It might be the conditions of the world, or my apartment currently covered in ginger tea. Could be any number of things. And it could be my response to those. And so what we get to do, the opportunity with suffering, is to really sort of take a backward step and say, okay, what is it that I'm really upset about? What I'm upset about often for me, and I don't know about for you, is that I have some notion that I have some control over my life and how it's unfolding and how it will unfold. And the fact is, I don't generally have control over things. I can try to do the next right thing. I can try to be thoughtful. I can certainly try to slow down a lot and get a better look at what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. But the fact of the matter is that, sometimes the cup of tea just tips over. Sometimes the quarantine rules just get suspended and everybody's free to do what they please. And I know that's not entirely true, but it's the way some people have been hearing it. But this suffering, the word in Pali is dukkha, and we think of it as suffering. But the more I was reading about it in the last few weeks, the more I find that it's a range of experiences from happiness to despair. And so for me, that was sort of interesting that happiness gets included in dukkha. And then I thought about the times in my life when I've been most happy, being with a close friend, maybe being in Paris or in Galway, the times when I've been really happy. And I think back on those times and think, I did spend some of that time. And I don't know if any of you experienced this, when you go on a nice vacation trip and you've been there for 2 days out of the 10 that you're going to be there, and you start thinking about having to go home. The vacation will end and I must repack that suitcase somehow. And, and just those little ways that my mind can begin to spin and say, even though I'm walking on Galway Bay, I'm already thinking about some stack of papers that I have to grade when I get back to my desk at home. So I think that there's this opportunity to take a look at that and say, okay, so how can we use practice to pause, to bring some spaciousness to the way my mind works, to the way our minds work. And so I remember back to when I first found my way to Buddhism, ill-advisedly going on a 4-day silent retreat in a monastery as my first experience. And I was able to, during the course of those 4 days, arouse a couple of moments of what I now know to be authentic self. I had a tiny sense of the kind of person that I could be, the kind of person that I wanted to be. And then a couple of seconds of realizing that when I wasn't busy at that time dealing with active alcoholism and addiction and active suffering based on a career that I wasn't quite sure about and a relationship that had just ended, that before I got tangled up in all that reality stuff, the kind of person I wanted to be actually was the kind of person that I had been at some other points in my life. And so in those moments, it was like, okay, so here's this idea of suffering and the idea of the cessation of suffering. And so it was everything I needed. And of course, we hear it in teachings, I had right inside of me. In that article I was telling you about, Sharon Salzberg is one of the writers, and she tells a wonderful story about a mom who was talking to her 4-year-old child. And she's telling the 4-year-old child that your nanny, the person that's cared for you for the last several years, is having to move away. She has a sick person in her family and she has to go back to where she came from. Doesn't mean she doesn't love you. She's not abandoning you, but she will be gone starting tomorrow. And the little 4-year-old boy looks up to his mom and gives her a little hug and says, okay, Mom, so that's good. So now tell me that story, but with a different ending. And I realized that for a lot of my life, and perhaps you can identify with that as well, I wanted a different ending. I had this feeling of unsatisfactoriness or not sure I had a life that mattered. And so I wanted a different ending. And, that added to the suffering because that's what I did, to sit around and stew about how I wish things were different. I wish the cards I had been dealt were different cards. And so I was dealing with that. And the fact of the matter is that what I was learning through these teachings, over my time in practice, is that I can have a different ending to the story. And the different ending to the story doesn't mean it'll be the one exactly that I want, but it does mean that I have the capacity through deepening my practice and through spending more time, on the cushion or the chair in my case, and deepening my practice and really reflecting on sort of who and what I have become and what kind of person that I would like to be, and probably was at one point. And so it's a matter of getting back to that authentic original self. So, all of that requires change. And there's a famous old saying around in my family and other Irish families, and I've heard it in recovery and other places. And it says there are two things that human beings hate the most: things exactly as they are and change. And so I found myself really in that experience of, okay, so, things are okay most days, some days a little sad, some days frustrating and angering, but by and large, okay, just okay. But I would like things to be delightful and joyful every day. That's, there are ways to engage joyfulness and delight as we're taught in our practice. And one of those ways, frankly, is to realize that suffering is part of our life. And that, the suffering that we have, whether it's psychospiritual or emotional or physical suffering, is all real. And we notice, I think, that in the best of times, and certainly in the last 15 months, that things don't always go exactly the way we want them to. But the response to those things is up to me. That's the part I get to change. I'm not the only one that was in quarantine. So on those days when I was just full of piss and vinegar about how awful my life was, I got a chance to say, there are other folks that are experiencing this too. So I think it's that opportunity to express, to accept and my suffering, and to accept and examine that suffering that really gives me this beautiful opportunity. As human beings, we're meaning makers, and we want things to make sense. And so we assign meanings to them. And, that meaning can come from inside me, or that meaning can come from a shared conversation, experience, teaching with others, friends and family, people in the sangha, a Buddhist teacher or teachers, many of them, if we have access. And that this opportunity to take a look at, what does this mean? Does it have to mean suffering, or can it mean this is the platform from which we are now operating, and how do we maximize our experience in terms of a life that matters, in terms of being present for ourselves, in terms of being present for each other. So this meaning may come from within, or it may come, for some people, from a higher power, or it may come from our spiritual practice and our practice of sangha, which is what I believe. And this meaning provides us hope and certainty that might otherwise have been lost. And so for me, it seems like there's really, I can stop working so hard to assign meaning to everything. Some things just happen. There's a 25-cent word that I'm going to give you that you probably all know. I just found out about it this week. It's called eschatology. And it basically means the ultimate meaning of something. eschatology. So you probably all know it, but somehow in my Detroit upbringing, we didn't used to say that word a lot. So it's this idea of the ultimate meaning of something. And there was a beautiful article about Buddhist eschatology that said in Buddhism, what is the ultimate meaning, right? What is the ultimate meaning? And it used this expression, which I really love. Does a rose have to do something? No. The purpose of a rose is to be a rose. So we do not have to, as individuals, run somewhere to become somebody else. Our purpose is to be us. And our practice is to find out who that me, or who that you, who that us really are. Wonderful just as we are. And that includes both suffering and delight. And so I think that's just this really wonderful opportunity that if we embrace the non-duality, that we will always have suffering and possibly always have joy as well. And the idea isn't to get rid of one of those or really struggle and run to achieve the other one. The idea is to find some balance, accepting that life contains both, trying to find some balance. So we know that we can't change the end of the story, as that mother was talking about with her son. But what we know is that we can figure out the key elements of the story and which ones we can live with and which ones we can work to make different. So the whole story isn't mine to change, but how I relate to the story and how I show up in the story can be mine to change. Last night, I heard a wonderful share from somebody talking about referencing Charlotte Joko Beck's book, Everyday Zen, and her teaching in that book that one of the things that we should be doing as part of our practice is looking for a bigger container. And she teaches about that, she taught, I should say, about that frequently. But the teaching, I think, is really quite beautiful. So she talks first about, taking that backward step and looking at the things that are going on in your life, the things that you resent, the things that you enjoy, the things that are causing you suffering, the things that are bringing you happiness or delight, and to recognize the paradox that both of those things exist always. And as the Buddha taught, we wouldn't have the capacity for delight and joy if we didn't have the reality of suffering, because it's through the one that we see the other, and through the other that we see the first. And what a wonderful idea that is, that we are informed and held by both of those things, and that one without the other would be a shallow and somewhat empty life. So I think this idea of finding a container big enough for my joy and my sorrow, big enough for the things I think I know and the things I discover on a regular basis that I don't know and don't need to know. I think that is really a wonderful concept, this idea of finding a container big enough to hold it all. And it's just, what a great idea that instead of spending many years of my life trying to run away from things I didn't like, or trying to distract myself from things that didn't feel good, or trying to, outrun the suffering that everybody in life, including me, experiences, to just find a container that feels safe, that feels holding, that feels next to and held by other people, and in that container to allow myself to have that range of experience. So to create a container that's big enough for all of my parts, all of my experiences, and all of my psychosocial, psychospiritual realities. So that seems to me really important. Sharon Salzberg says the most important thing her teacher said to her was that every time she went to him to complain, he would listen to her for a while, and then he would say, that's dukkha, isn't it? This is dukkha, isn't it? And that, suffering is part of our lives. And an important teaching is just to say, yep, it is, as is joy and delight. And we get to try and figure out a way to balance those. Last week, Reverend Mio talked to us about Mingyur Rinpoche's teachings of the three kinds of knowledge, the wisdom that's based on hearing. As we hear a talk, or I read last night, the talk was so good that I heard that I went and got Judge Joe Kobeck's book off the shelf and read it last night as I was going to sleep. And so that's the talk of hearing, the wisdom of hearing. And there's the wisdom based on reflection, which is my opportunity today to really think about creating a container big enough for me to hold everything, all the parts of me, and for you each to find a container big enough that when you take the backward step and look at all of your parts and all of your joys and sorrows, you have that opportunity to hold them someplace safe and held and filled with love. And then the third piece, as I understand it, is the wisdom of meditative cultivation. The teaching has entered the deepest level at this point of my practice. And I really get a chance to experience and to know the teaching, to know those words. And it begins to express itself in my life and in the way I live and in the way my sanghas live. And then to remember, as the Buddha teaches, that the teaching has entered the deepest level of my practice, and that all of my life is my practice, not just the very important half hour I spend on the cushion every day, or in the chair, because I'm too old for a cushion, but not that half hour, but all of it on the chair, in meditation, and in the rest of life. And so I think that it's this wonderful opportunity to really, when I thought about giving a talk and having us spend some time thinking about and talking about suffering, I thought, well, that's not going to be very much fun. And the more I read, the more I didn't immediately jump to some sort of delight, but I did come to a place of just a real sense of ease and peace that there is suffering, and there's always going to be suffering, and there's the possibility and reality of joy, and there's always going to be that. And if I don't push one away and chase after the other one, and I, in times in my life, I've done both. I've sometimes seemingly chased after suffering, because I certainly found it. And so I get that opportunity. And so as I was thinking about this, I want to share a poem with you just as I close that really, we've had the last 15 months, but we've also had our whole lives, our whole practice and our whole lives, to take a look at these concepts and to think about how we're going to balance suffering and happiness, of suffering and joy. And this is a poem that was written by someone named Carolyn Kaufman. And she says, well, you made it. You survived. The unbearable weight is suddenly lifted. The endless night has broken into dawn. The uphill battle led you to a peak, and now you stand tall at the summit. So now what? What do you do next? There is now air to breathe and room to grow, and time to fill that you did not plan for. You did not plan on having this life worth living, and suddenly here it is. So now what? How will you make the most of it? How will you live the life that you might never have thought you'd get a chance to see again. And so as we come out of 15 months of quarantine into some many months of who knows what, as we come off our meditation seats today and walk through the rest of our lives, as we figure out how to be back together with each other in person, but very importantly, celebrate how we have not been socially distant. We have been spiritually connected in an amazing way through these Saturday sessions and the other things that happen at Hartford Street. And so we don't have to run wildly into the street as though we hadn't had any human connection or spiritual connection. We get to say, we found a new way to be really connected, to communicate with each other and to hold each other. And isn't that wonderful? And so as we do whatever it is we're going to do next, we get that opportunity to say, so what now? How will we lead these lives that we've been given? Thank you.
Thank you, Koshin-san. Do we have time for questions, maybe? Questions and comments, please just unmute yourself. Kato-san.
I just want to ask about that term, again, that word. We didn't have 25-cent words in the mountains of Colorado either. So what was that, like, ultimate meaning or highest meaning, or what was that again? You're on mute.
I'll send you the connection. It's eschatology. And I found a nice article about it. I've got a few lines about it. Excuse me, about Buddhist eschatology. So I don't have it right in front of me.
I'll have to take a look at the detail, but it makes me nervous.
Yeah.
Makes me really nervous.
Right. Me too. Me too. And I think the point of the teaching is that we don't have to do it. It's like that we don't have to look for some ultimate meaning. That we have this opportunity to be present in this moment and to stop chasing around trying to make meaning out of everything and just really live the experience.
Great. Thank you. Just hear words like that and I think of religion and I get scared.
Right. Well, that's when you look that word up on Google, the first thing that pops up is Catholic eschatology, Christian eschatology. I was like, okay, so I'm happy that Sharon Salzberg used that word. I will never use it again. but turns out there's some opportunities to think about it.
Yeah, bingo, I thought so. Interesting. Thank you.
Hokai-san.
Okay, Stephen, thank you. Thank you for your talk. I had a question, especially because you're a psychologist, about, I guess the word would be caretaking others. And I asked this because, in this weird transition, I'm fully vaccinated. So I've been like, okay, I'm going to walk the trails around here without a mask, but then people look at me funny. And I feel like, is it just easier to put on a mask to try to take care of others? Or should we actually just try to push through and do what we're said? I don't know. That's sort of my question.
Yeah, I think that's this whole mask thing, especially right now, is such a wonderful opportunity for us to think about how we show up in the world. Am I wearing a mask to protect myself? Am I wearing a mask to protect others? And now in theory, we have this opportunity to be told by the government that you don't have to wear it to protect others. So if you're wearing it, it might just be because you're nervous. And it's like, wait a minute, I had all figured out that I was going to keep wearing a mask forever because I wanted to take care of everybody else. And aren't I the most compassionate, thoughtful person? But you get to take that backward step and say, okay, so what is my motivation for wearing the mask? And on the other side, as you say, what's my motivation for taking it off? It's like, part of me, I won't speak for you, part of it's like, oh, thank God, get this thing off. And, people stop telling me what I have to do. And, and then I go down a rabbit hole of it. I couldn't breathe with the damn thing on anyway. And so, of course, I'm taking it off. And, I've got all sorts of story, some meaning that I've created there. But I think that for me, at least today, what I'm taking is that I want the opportunity to keep as many people safe as possible. And even at an ideal situation where we get the 80 or 90% of the folks vaccinated, the vaccine's good for 95%. And so there's still, some, and I've stopped studying epidemiology because A, I didn't know what I was talking about, and B, it just makes me nervous. And so it's like, I'm not sure that my wearing a mask in the circles that I travel in really has much benefit. But where I've settled is exactly what you said, Hoda, is that, when people look at me funny, are they wondering if I'm a Trumper or if I'm an anti-vaxxer, an anti-masker, or are they genuinely worried about their health? And so for as long as people are looking at me funny, I don't want to make anybody uncomfortable. So it's easy enough for me to wear the mask. So for right now, I'm doing that. But as you know, as others know, I walk on the beach a lot, and I will confess that when I'm on the beach with my shoes off, walking out, 20 feet out into the water, I don't wear a mask out there. So there are times, but I think it's that wonderful thing of trying to figure out why are we doing it? What's the real motivation for that? And it's just a metaphor for so many other things in our lives. What am I really doing? And especially, I think, in our caretaker roles, how much of our caretaking is entwined with an agenda of our own about how we want to feel about what we're doing.
Thank you.
Reverend Leo.
Stephen, it occurred to me if your talk is sort of like a jewel, we could turn it and look at another facet. And I was wondering about the point of view of that Buddha made a central fact of his insight was the absence of a self, so-called. Mm-hmm. So from that point of view, how do we look at your approach to suffering and joy and so forth?
Yeah. Thank you. And I don't know how we all do, but I know for me, when I hear that no self, the way I'm able to work with that, resonate with that, understand it, is no separate self. And so Thich Nhat Hanh and other people who use the expression interconnectedness of all beings. And so I like with the question that Max and I were just talking about, it's the mask wearing or not is not just my personal decision, it's the connection between all of us. And so for me personally, I would take the mask off right now and never wear it again because my ears hurt and I can't breathe. That's the story I have. Neither of those is actually true, but that's the story I have. But when it comes to thinking about how I want to be in the world, I want to be part of a sangha, a community, a globe that cares for each other. And so if my wearing a mask will make other people more comfortable, I'm willing to do that for a while. And so I think that's the bigger principle as well, is that try to spend less time thinking about me and what makes me safe, me comfortable, and more about the relational pieces of my life and my spiritual practice, which is how do we, as bodhisattvas, how do we all get towards enlightenment and liberation together and not one at a time, racing to the finish line to jump over.
Yeah, David. David, you have to unmute.
There we go, right?
Yep, we got you.
Stephen's talk made me recall an incident of a couple of 3 weeks ago, and Myo's comment just now about the place of the self within this context of joy and suffering sort of underscored that. And what it was over the past few months, I've been looking to see if I could make some new friends via online apps, in lieu of actually trying to go out through meetup groups or whatever to make new friends. And I had a brief text conversation with a person who we shared several interests, and I felt it was a very lively and entertaining, informative, and so on. And so it came to an end. The person sort of signed off, and I had this experience of, oh, well, that was really nice. I didn't know what it was developing into, if anything, but whatever it was, I wanted more.
Oh, we lost David. We lost some of that. I don't know what happened to the connection.
That
Right as it was turning into something.
That joy, that no, if it was going to develop into a friendship or what, right? I'm just enjoying
No, we
the moment.
can't hear it, David. I'm sorry.
And
I
then the
don't know
moment
what
stopped.
I don't know what's going on, but
And
we missed a lot of
body,
that.
mind. Is this any better?
That's
Yes.
better.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, anyways, maybe I've got a bad connection up here in my room. This
Uh-oh.
momentary feeling of pleasure came up, and then it went away, and I thought to myself, wasn't concerning my moment, that joyous moment stopped, and at that moment I could feel within my body mind this the feeling of suffering. It's like I had something that was good, now it's gone. And the most interesting thing about the whole experience was, in realizing that, I was able to go, okay, it's all good. It was there, now it's gone.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we go through that experience all the time. Phenomena arises, and maybe it's a feeling of joy, maybe it's a feeling of pain, maybe it's whatever. It's a moment that arises and a moment that passes away. So to me, that was a very concrete experience of the lack of an abiding self. It was a momentary instance that came up and then went away.
Mm-hmm.
So that to me is that interface, as it were, between this so-called self and phenomena.
Mm-hmm.
I was very happy to have that experience.
Well, we missed, because of the Zoom breaking up, how that experience ended. So we've all made up our own versions of how that ended for you.
Well, it ended was the person signed off with the text, and I didn't know if we would reconnect. You know, apparently there's a certain etiquette when texting with unknown people, that you don't want to be clamoring after them when there's sort of messages there like, okay, this is over and done with, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I knew it was over. I was able to read between the lines enough to know that experience of a couple of long text sessions was over, and may or may not come again. I couldn't concern myself with whether it would come again or not.
Yeah. Well, I think there's the opportunity, right? It's like you get to say, well, I had some sort of even unspoken expectation about how this would go. And if it went that way, what kind of joy that would create for me. And the fact is, it went some other way. And, you're able to say, I'm glad I had that experience because I learned some things and, had a couple of nice conversations. And And now I'm willing, because it was a basic positive experience, even though it didn't end the way I wanted it to. I may try it again. And so, we have that opportunity, as you say. It's like, okay, so it didn't go. I didn't get to write the story, but I do get to step back and say, you know what? The story didn't end the way I wanted it to, but the story was okay.
I think the story is probably always okay.
Yeah.
We just may not be able to accept that a lot of the time.
Yeah. Like the little boy said, "Mommy, tell me that story again, but with a different ending."
Yes.
It may be time for tea and cookies.
Well, how about Ransan? One final question there.
Sure.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, that story, thank you, David, reminded me of how the elements we have. Are we going to focus on the joyous aspect of a phenomenon or the suffering aspect of a phenomenon? And I think I have a tendency to look for the suffering aspect sometimes of a phenomenon that didn't go as I had written it in my head. Probably because of my background, my family background, my dysfunctional family background, where things often didn't go the way that I wanted them to. And I become used to that kind of interpretation of things. So I guess, thank you for reminding me, we have a choice oftentimes, in all situations. There's some real suffering that's to be had out there. Ambiguous situations like that, you have some choice, get positive energy, maybe standalone energy or a standalone situation. Maybe it's not, but stay open to whatever it is to become. And I think it's ambiguity that sometimes is hard to accept.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. I think it's really important when we think about this idea of living with suffering and joy as a balance, that we not take it as one more opportunity to beat ourselves up. I was reading about Steve Stuckey, who was the abbot at Zen Center in the course of the last couple of weeks, thinking about this topic. And by all accounts, when he got sick, he decided to soldier on in a beautiful, wonderful way. But that he wasn't going to let suffering take away from his joy in teaching and being with other people. And I thought, damn, if I get a bad cold, I want to be left alone and unplug my phone. And so there's one more, why can't I be a saint like him? And so we are entitled to our experiences of fear and sorrow and anger. And then we get to, as you just said, we get to decide how to deal with those and what we're going to do and how long we're going to sit there and at what point we're going to reach out to other human beings. But I just would hate for any of us to use the opportunity that we're not able to balance suffering and joy in some displayed kind of way as another opportunity to beat ourselves up, because I think that's really not what the practice is about, and that's not what the Buddhist teachings are about. And people do things differently, and they hold their feelings differently, and they've got different life experiences, as you just described. So we get to be real with our feelings, and then, as you say, we get to make a choice about at what point are they adaptive and helpful, and at what point are they not adaptive anymore, and maybe we can move on through them, let some of them go.
Thank you. I just wanted to add, just to turn the gem once more, and as I see it, this issue of self, no self. As I understand Buddha's teaching, what he was saying or is saying is, people say there are the phenomena of our lives, there are experiences, and then the assumption is there's a self. And Buddha's teaching is, no, the only self there is the phenomena of your life.
Mhm.
There isn't some self in addition to that. And that to me is a pretty potent meditation.
Thank you.
Okay, well, Stephen Koshin-san, thank you so much for an edifying talk.